Hi from the English department again. This is Edgar Allan Poe, but today this is actually Mr. Donahue, but talking about Edgar Allan Poe. But today we're going to talk about horror stories, not just before the previous video was about the detective stories. On the surface, Poe's horror stories are horrific. They're super scary stuff. People get murdered in the most gruesome of manners. They're chopped to pieces. They're buried alive. They have an axe buried in their skull. They're cut in half by a medieval torture device of the Inquisition. They're poisoned. The list goes on. Sure, all of this is scary stuff. And it has been seen and reused and rewritten and redone for over 100 years. Think of all of the modern horror movies that you see and how much of those movies are just like Poe's stories. But that's not what makes Poe's horror stories so interesting. What makes Poe's horror stories so interesting and so frightening is his penchant, his intellectual curiosity in getting inside the mind of the killer. Think back to freshman year when you read The Cask of Amontillado. We know the mind of the character of Montresor. We know he wants to kill Fortunato. We know how he plans it. We know what it sounded like. We have that description of Fortunato's last screaming breath, his last sobs. But what I find ultimately interesting in this is the characters need to confess. Poe gets inside of the heads of these characters and creates them as really interesting characters, but he doesn't leave them incomplete. He explains why. He explains the disturbed mind and why the disturbed mind wants to kill someone, but doesn't leave out the fact that human beings are moral beings, that we have a need for confession. On page 177 in the book is something that the book calls an essay, but it's not really an essay. It's a part of a story called The Imp of the Perverse. I don't know why the editors of the text decided to call this an essay, because it's not. It's actually the opening of the story, which sounds a lot like an essay, but it's really the killer reasoning out, sort of like the detectives do in his detective stories, reasoning out why he wants to kill someone. I want you to listen to just the opening of the story. Here's a picture of the book again.
Overlooked by all the moralists who have preceded them. We saw no need of the impulse or the propensity. The intellectual or logical man, rather than the understanding or observant man, set himself to imagine designs, to dictate purposes to God. Having thus fathomed to his satisfaction the intentions of Jehovah, out of these intentions he built his innumerable systems of mind. In the matter of phrenology, for example, we first determined, naturally enough, that it was the design of the deity that man should eat. We then assigned to man an organ of alimentiveness, and this organ is the scourge with which the deity compels man, will I, into eating. Secondly, having settled it to be God's will that man should continue his species, we discovered an organ of amativeness forthwith. And so with combativeness, with ideality, with causality, with constructiveness. So in short, with every organ, whether representing a propensity, a moral sentiment, or a faculty of the pure intellect. It would.
So here we have the killer in this story rationalizing his desire to kill, to overcome this organ, as he calls it, that the deity, God, has created within us. We have to eat, otherwise we die. We have to take care of our moral being, otherwise our moral being will die. And this is typical of Poe's killers. They rationalize, they try to explain to us why they did what they did, why they're innocent, why they're should be forgiven. We tremble with violence at the conflict within us of substance with shadow, the character in The Imp of the Perverse says. Poe taps into the darkness that resides in all of us, but is never acted on. I mean, if we acted on it, we would walk down the street and just punch somebody in the head. That's why I've included a video, a report on that knockout game. The question for the knockout game is, are we living in a Poe nightmare now? Have we lost that moral battle within ourselves? Have we given into what he calls in that story? Have we given into the imp, the spirit of the perverse within us? Have we given up that fight? And are we now just becoming a violent, without remorse culture? That's what's truly scary about Poe's characters. And then, of course, the opposite is true when they give into the imp of perversity in terms of confessing. You have characters that have gotten away with murder for years, and they walk up to a policeman and they confess. That's what happens in The Imp of the Perverse. Think back to freshman year when you read the Cask of Amontillado. That whole story is really a confessional to the reader that Montresor is giving, asking for forgiveness. So no matter how these murderous characters devise their murders and act on them, there's still some sort of moral need that has to be filled. That's all now.